Hey, look at that, Nintendo predicted the rapture.
A limited-run retail edition and a digital edition of the game will be available for a limited time.
That's a shame. I suppose portly Italian plumbers are no longer a marketable fad this year. I didn't think that would mean evaporation, but still. What do I do now? Alright, so I went out, did a bit of shopping to see if I could find another plumber-based platforming adventure. I found WarioWare.
The Mohawk. Point the tip of the form baton forward.
Where are the dungarees?
It's one of the best games I ever played, but it has a severe lacking of plumbing in it, so I'll throw it aside for whoever comes to possess my inheritance next. I also picked up some fruit, I just needed it. I got a heart of Battenberg to just munch on through the day. And I also found an unmarked NES. Oh no.
Okay, so brace yourself for this. Like, honestly, prepare yourself for this. I'm sure the Bible warned us of that.
It's just Sonic!
This is Somari. At first glance it might look like a Chinese counterfeit, possibly a sprite swap of an existing game. But no, is it an elaborate ROM hack created by a fan? Not quite. Somari is an actually genuinely playable, built from scratch, fully original NES title, with an asterisk on all three of those.
It's quite an infamous title, with the only credit to its name being the Somari team, and while it seems impossible to determine exactly where the game comes from, most of the original cartridges appear to be made for the Famicom, giving a clear indication towards Asia, with Western fans later making repo cartridges for the NES. Somari is notoriously associated with the Dendy system in particular, which was a semi-official hardware clone of the Nintendo Famicom produced in Taiwan for the Russian market, which helps narrow down the origins of the title.
As for the release date, some of the cartridges do credit the copyright to Somari in 1994, which seems like a pretty decent approximation. At core it seems like a typical setup for a typical mass-produced pirated title, but as for the game itself...
Oh, yeah, oh, that's exactly how I remember that song playing on the Sega Genesis.
I will admit, I think it's a pretty decent title screen for the NES, but title screens have deceived me before, so I don't want to judge it just yet.
Predictably, the first stage is Green Hill Zone.
If Sonic Forces did it, why wouldn't you?
And immediately we were off before we can even touch the floor, never mind. The game actually looks pretty decent. Badniks are faithfully redrawn with the NES's limitations, and I commend the stages likewise being originally redrawn based on the 16-bit version of Sonic the Hedgehog, rather than being sprite rips from the 8-bit Master System and Game Gear companion titles. What doesn't come across visually is how awkward these controls are though. Rather than gradually building up momentum, they're sort of 3 states of movement between a slow walk, which moves on to a leisurely jog, and then actually fast. It's really hard to walk long enough to progress to the next state, and the placement of enemies leads to constant disruptions. Likewise, the slightest incline will immediately drag you back down to a crawl, and going down doesn't help you build up speed either. Despite that, if you go through a loop, it will instantly upgrade you to the high state of speed, and somehow keep that to a downward incline, and you'll completely go over it and just fall down. On a side note, turning around requires a lengthy slide before coming to a full stop, and naturally the whole speed up process begins yet again. Jumping is oddly lenient and easy to maneuver from a standstill, but practically impossible to control with the slightest of speed going into it beforehand. It's also not very high, and the game has a lot of hits like this one, where if you fall in, you're now in an anti-soft lock fighting for your own death against bouncing rings.
Janky homebrew, mate!
Post-hit invincibility is an odd one too. When you collide with an enemy, your immunity period starts immediately, but this typically leads to constant ricocheting into an inevitable demise because the immunity is up by the time you can move again. If you get hit and land on spikes though, it takes ages for you to become vulnerable again, and with rings flying around in such a tight space, that only complicates the floor. The one bit of credit I'll give to the game is that it did recreate the spin dash from Sonic 2. And it doesn't work. Well, it doesn't work on monitors. Rolling into Badniks is still viable at least, which gives you a small hop, and that can actually lead to fun combos and an untimely death. When you bounce from an enemy in any context, you again lose all of your momentum and control, and it's just flawed in this context of being a platforming game, especially one based on building up speed. It took me half an hour to beat Green Hill Zone alone because of all this. After enough of that constant grind though, I did manage to make it to the first boss, which who would have thought It's Dr. Robotnik and a wrecking ball.
If Sonic Forces did it, why wouldn't you?
Like the common badniks, the boss is programmed surprisingly well if you ignore the constant sprite flickering. A compromise had to be made, I guess. As is everything else, it's a bit awkward to platform around due to the controls, but whenever you get hit, your rings will ricochet back to you because of an off-screen capsule, so hey, don't fret too much, I'm sure Somari will be okay. The boss is essentially an endurance test because of this. It takes way more than 8 hits to defeat Robotnik. Give it long enough though and yep, there he goes.
From here the game goes on to copy all of the other zones from the original Sonic the Hedgehog. Most of the original zones from the original Sonic the Hedgehog. Unlike Green Hill Zone, which was for the most part original in layout, give or take the odd iconic set piece inaccurately translated. All of the other zones in this game follow the Genesis port, technically 1-to-1.
Marble Zone is practically a 1-to-1 identical port of the 16-bit stage, and while the original level is often criticised for being so much slower paced than Green Hill Zone, this actually works out pretty well in Somari's case due to the relative stiffness of his controls. I mean, it's not a perfect port by any means, but I did actually enjoy playing through it, unlike Green Hill Zone where I died tens of times, but only once in Marble at the very end of the zone, which made me realise a big flaw with the game. There's no checkpoints in any of these acts.
What?
There's none in the entire game, which for Spring Yard Zone was a pain in the... Because of this, the original level has a heavy focus on momentum and pinballing, but this was not replicated at all in Somari. Interestingly though, downward slopes are specifically programmed to automatically put you in full speed in this zone, and the airball spike balls were implemented perfectly too. The moving platforms weren't carried over and remained completely, or I guess incompletely static. Otherwise, like Marble Zone, the level design is a perfect recreation of the 16-bit layout. Even the boss's reliance on breakable footing is here. Eat your heart out, Unreal Engine. The NES can handle dynamic level structure. This authenticity is lost a bit in the following 2 acts, which don't actually fully replicate all of the original game mechanics, and by extent diverge a bit in layout. Surprisingly, Labyrinth Zone's water mechanics are fully intact, even down to the reliance on air bubbles to stop Somari from drowning. I also love that to circumnavigate the Famiclone's limitations, the underwater sections of the stage are simply tiled a different colour than above the surface. It's nowhere near as technically complex as the Genesis ability to render layered water, but it's just as effective. What wasn't as effective is the music. It suffered quite a bit from the Backport. The soundtrack I've been banging to while playing this game has come from the official 8-bit version of Sonic the Hedgehog, which is an experience in its own right, separate from the original and Somari, which instead opted to translate the Mega Drive soundtrack for the Nintendo sound chip, which came out... ear-curdling? My favourite technical change is the wholly original boss fight made for Starlight Zone, replacing the original which was reliant on physics seesaws, which again couldn't be replicated with a Dendy apparently. Following that boss, the game completely passes over an entire zone from Sonic the Hedgehog and moves immediately to the final zone, which returns to the format of replicating the 16-bit bosses on 8-bit hardware. The energy balls are a lot slower paced than usual, but the actual piston mechanic thing is impossible to predict and offers pretty much no chance to time an attack unless you're already right next to it. Again, unlike the original incarnation. It's pretty easy to adapt to at least, give it a few hits and eventually it'll break down with Somari running to the side, assumably finishing the game.
Do you reckon I should give him a push? I don't think he knows about the 3rd dimension.
I don't really know what's happening here. I'm honestly not touching anything on the control. Okay, look at that. I've completed the game, apparently.
Every step of this adventure was played with technicalities not working as intended. But despite all that, I'm really fond of the ambitious feat they tried to pull off porting this game to the NES. Is it a worthy successor? No, not at all. It's not great, but it's ambitious. Blotched together, but just about works. It's over now though, so if you'll excuse me, I'm going to boil it beyond redemption so it gets a faint better off than my Game & Watch.